Hello and welcome to another episode of Communication How. In the previous two episodes, we were dealing with the traditions in communication theory. So far, we have seen the semiotic tradition and the phenomenological tradition. Today, we shall take a look at another tradition that is important in our daily lives as we communicate with others. And this tradition is the cybernetic tradition. Now, what is the cybernetic tradition all about? What are the key concepts? What are the key ideas of the cybernetic tradition? And the salient features of this tradition, we shall all deal with in today's episode. But before we can actually begin, each one of us could ask ourselves this particular question. What characterizes your family? Could you adequately describe your family by showing a picture of them? How about adding a description of each person? Well, we will see that neither of these approaches would be sufficient to really get across an idea of what your family is. Because we see a family is more than a collection of persons. And in order to fully understand family life, you would need to look at how the family members interact with one another, how they influence one another, and the different ways of communication that takes place within the family and how the family changes over time. And in this way, we see that the cybernetic perspective is necessary in order to understand the depth and complexity of family dynamics. Now, when we look at the term cybernetic, we see that cybernetics is the tradition of complex systems in which many interacting elements influence one another. So in other words, it is basically number of systems together interacting with one another, influencing one another in order to get the desired result. Now we see that theories in the cybernetic tradition explain how physical, biological, social, and behavioral processes work. Now, within the whole cybernetic tradition, communication is understood as a system of parts or variables that influence one another. In this way, we see that they also shape and control the character of the overall system. Like any organism, they achieve both balance and change. And here we see that in the cybernetic tradition, it is the systems interacting with one another, influencing one another. And a perfect example of this could be your computer system, which of course is made up of many parts, such as you have the CPU, you also have the RAM, you also have the GPU or the graphics card, you also have the motherboard, you also have the PSU, the power supply unit. And we see that all these elements need to interact with one another. They need to play a part. They need to perform their own role. And in this way, we see that if one part is not functioning properly, as a result of that, the whole system is affected. And if we keep this example in mind, we will probably be able to understand the nitty-gritties and the important aspects of the cybernetic tradition. So let us take a look at some of the key ideas in the cybernetic tradition. Now we see that the idea of a system forms the core of the cybernetic thinking. Now we see that systems are sets of interacting components that together form something more than the sum of the parts. Now, for example, the complexity of family, which we discussed earlier, makes it an ideal example of a communication system. Now, we see that family members are not isolated from one another, and their relationships must be taken into account to fully understand the family as a system. Like families, we see that all systems are unique wholes characterized by a pattern of relationships. And therefore, we see that all the systems within the cybernetic tradition are characterized by a particular pattern of relationships. Any part of the system is always constrained by its dependence on another part. And this pattern of interdependence organizes the system itself. In the example of the computer that we saw, we see that the parts tend to depend on one another. The information, the feedback, the data that is passed from one part to another enables the system as a whole to function. And therefore, when we take a look at the cybernetic tradition, it also includes a lot of interaction between various systems and also the feedback that is received from these systems, the interdependence. All this organizes the system together, and therefore we see that this plays a very important part in the cybernetic tradition. Now we see that a system cannot remain alive without importing new resources in the form of inputs. Therefore, we see a system takes in inputs from the environment, it processes these inputs, and then it creates outputs back into the environment. Now, sometimes the inputs and outputs are tangible materials, whereas sometimes they consist of energy and information. Now, in addition to interdependence, we see that systems are also characterized by self-regulation and control. In other words, systems monitor, regulate, and control their outputs in order to remain stable and in order to achieve the goals that they are meant to achieve. So, as we see that various systems in our day-to-day lives, there is a constant monitoring that takes place. There's also regulation. And in this way, this monitoring and regulation helps to control the output, helps to control the desired result. And in this way, they are able to achieve their goals that they are meant to achieve. Now, if we take a look at examples, we can say that a thermostat and a heater is a simple example of system control. On the other hand, if you take a look at an airplane, now that is an example of an incredibly complex system that is able to maintain sufficient control through a highly complex system of interactions among parts to get cargo and passengers to their desired destination. Now, let us come to the example of the heater or the thermostat. Now, when we say that this is an example of a simple control system, we see that there is just one or two dials on the system, and the system basically has only one desired function, and that is in order to control the temperature. So basically the task of the thermostat or the heater is quite straightforward. Maintain the temperature. When there's a need to increase, you increase. When there is a need to decrease, it sort of lowers the temperature. When it comes to an aeroplane, it is much more different. It is much more complicated because you have different parts performing different functions, and each of these parts need to perform at their optimum level in order to make sure that the plane is in the air and that people and cargo are being transported from one destination to the other. And therefore, when we see some of the plane crashes, when we see some of these accidents or some of these malfunctioning, we see that even one part could be fatal. If one part is not functioning properly, if one part is not sending adequate data, for example, if the sensors are not working, it could relay confusing messages to the pilots. And as a result of this, it affects the whole system as such. And therefore, they say that the aeroplane is an example of a highly complex system where you have so many systems, so many sensors working together, constantly relaying data back and forth. And therefore, we see that because the system exists in a dynamic environment, it must be adaptable and able to change. And in this way, we see that this constant regulation, this constant monitoring, thus plays a very important role in making sure that systems are working at their optimum level. Now we can look at what the system theorists basically have to say. So we see that system theorists are not simply interested in the nature of a system and its function, but they are interested in how a system manages to sustain and control itself over time. Now, how a plane manages to fight gravity, wind currents, and other forces, and to direct itself along a programmed course is something which is an example of this. That is how a system manages to sustain and control itself over time. Now, this can happen because of systems within systems. So in the aeroplane, we see that there are so many systems together which form part of the bigger system. For example, when it comes to operating the various parts on the plane, there are systems even for that. For example, for operating the ailerons, for operating the rudder, etc. So we see that there are systems within systems that are interdependent and play a very important role. Apart from that, we also see that systems are embedded within one another, such that one system is part of a larger system. And in this way, we see that this forms a series of increasing complexity. And we can take a very broad view by observing a system that has number of systems which interact with one another in a large supra system. Or we can take a narrower view by observing a smaller subsystem. So the example of the thermostat, which was a smaller subsystem, and the aeroplane, which is a large supra system. So in this way, if we take these two examples, we can probably get a clear idea of how complexity and simplicity is achieved in these two examples. For example, the aeroplane, complex system, various systems operating at the same time within systems in order to get the desired results. So now we see that in a complex system, a series of feedback loops, and this loops connects the parts. So we see that there are various feedback loops, and these loops relay constant data. And this is something that connects the parts to one another because there's constant information being passed. Now, these feedback loops are called networks. Now, we can see a simple example of this is in this particular diagram. So in this figure, we can see that the plus signs which are there, these plus signs will denote a positive relationship. Whereas when we look at these negative signs, these denote a negative relationship. Now, what is a positive and a negative relationship? We'll discuss shortly. Well, first and foremost, we see that in a positive relationship, variables increase and decrease together. So in a way, there is a direct relationship. Let's take this example of the family income and the access to health. So we see here, when there is an increase in the family income, there is an increase of access to healthcare. So when they have more income, they can probably go to better hospitals and avail better facilities. So therefore, we see that this is a positive relationship because when one variable has increased, so has the other. So increase in family income has led to an increase in access to healthcare. Now let's take a look at the next step. Now, an increase in the access to healthcare has led to a decrease in the illness in the family. So therefore, this becomes a negative relationship because when one variable has increased, the other variable has decreased. So in this way, we see since both the variables are not equally increased or decreased, because of that, we see it is a negative relationship. So we see that when one variable increases, the other one decreases. Similarly, we take a look at the next example. So when the illness in the family has decreased, attendance at school and work has increased. And once again, we see that this is a negative relationship because when this has decreased, this has increased. That is, attendance has increased. So when one variable has sort of decreased, the other variable has increased. And similarly, we can see that the next example will give us a positive relationship because when attendance increases in school and work, success also increases. So therefore, you see that both the variables are increasing. Now, if, for example, the family income had to decrease, we would see that the access to healthcare would also decrease. Now, would it be a positive or a negative relationship? Well, we see that it would still be a positive relationship because both the variables have decreased simultaneously. So because the family income has decreased, the access to healthcare has also decreased. So therefore, we see that we need to understand the positive relationship properly because we see that in a positive relationship, the variables increase or decrease together. The word together is very important. And in this way, we see that in a negative relationship, the variables increase or decrease inversely. And there is no direct relationship between the two. And therefore, we see that in this way, we can understand how this complex system of various systems working within each other, how feedback connects the parts together. Now, when we take a look at the cybernetic tradition, we see that the key ideas of system theory are amazingly coherent and consistent, and they have a major impact on many fields, including communication. Now, because of its wide applicability in virtual, physical, and social environments, we see that the cybernetic tradition is not monolithic. And thus, we see that we can make many distinctions among the variations of the system theory. And therefore, we see that what is important when it comes to the cybernetic tradition is that these ideas of systems working consistently, working coherently, have an impact on major fields. And therefore, we see that it is used in variety of fields, which therefore makes it a very important tradition to learn and understand. Now, with this being said, we can now move on to the salient features or the salient points of the cybernetic tradition. Well, first and foremost, we can say that the cybernetic tradition is a tradition of complex systems in which interacting elements influence one another. So we see that theories in the cybernetic tradition explain how physical, biological, social, and behavioral processes work. And at the core of the cybernetic thinking is the idea of a system. So systems are basically sets of interacting components that together form something more than the sum of parts. So therefore, we see that a system is not just basically parts put together. For example, your computer is not just RAM, motherboard, CPU, graphics card, just added together. It is basically these components working together giving information to each other, giving feedback, and thus performing tasks simultaneously in order to achieve the desired result. And therefore, we see that systems are sets of interacting components that influence one another. And therefore, any part of the system is always constrained by its dependence on other parts. And therefore, we see that communication is one of the parts or variables in the systems. Now, we see that a system takes in inputs from the environment, it processes them, and creates outputs that are put back into the environment. And we see that sometimes the inputs and outputs could be tangible materials, whereas sometimes they could also consist of energy and information. Now, apart from interdependence, of which we have spoken a lot, we see that systems are also characterized by self-regulation and control. So in other words, we see that systems monitor, regulate, and control their outputs in order to achieve goals and in order to remain stable. Now, systems are always embedded within one another, such that one system is part of a larger system. And in this way, we see that this leads to forming a series of levels of increasing complexity. And therefore, we see that system theory has been important to the communication theory because of the way variables impact one another through various levels of system. And therefore, we see that changes in variables play a very important role. And thus, having seen the cybernetic tradition, having seen how the various systems interact and work with each other, we can come to know at how things function in our day-to-day world. Similarly, even when we relate or communicate with one another, we see that there are a variety of things going on simultaneously. And thus we see that because of its complex nature, because of the way in these systems are able to communicate with one another, the way they are embedded and they interact with one another, we see that this theory is being used in a variety of fields. And this brings us to the end of the cybernetic tradition. So I'm sure that we will be able to sum up the cybernetic tradition as that which is basically a complex system in which interacting elements influence one another. And therefore, we know that the core of the cybernetic thinking is the idea of system. So thank you for watching this video. And next time, we will be dealing with another tradition, that is the socio-psychological tradition. So till then, thank you for watching and hope to see you as we deal with the next tradition, that is the socio-psychological tradition.